Okay, welcome everybody. This is Sofia's first panel event of the year. I'm very proud to be welcoming our 4 panelists this evening to talk about human rights in the age of COVID-19. So a very topical debate this evening. So please join me in welcoming Michael O'Flaherty, who is the EU director, the director of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. We have Liam Herrick from the ICCL. We have Rujin Habibi, and we also have István Hegedűs. Hopefully I didn't ruin anyone's names there in pronunciation. And thank you very much as well to our moderator from TCD, David Fennelly. Now I'm not going to take any more time up. I'm going to hand over to David. So there will be the discussion and the debate, and then we will open the floor up for questions at the end. The event will be recorded as per usual. So if you don't want to be on the recording, turn off your cameras. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, David, and our panelists.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, for the invitation to moderate, and thanks to Sofia for organising this event, to all the committee, including Aminata, who I understand played a central role in organising it. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. You've picked a really important topic and you've got excellent speakers, so I'm not going to delay people any longer. I'll just introduce the individual speakers and speak for a few minutes to open our discussion about the topic, and then we can kickstart a more general discussion and take on board any questions people have. Karima Benoune, writing in the latest volume of the American Journal of International Law, described COVID-19 as a cataclysm for human rights and a foundational challenge for international human rights law. And I think over the past year, we've seen the very varied dimensions of this challenge. And it's going to be great to gather together the different perspectives around the room. And we're starting with Michael O'Flaherty, who's no stranger to these shores. Michael is, as Charlotte has said, the director of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. Before that, he was director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at NUIG. And before that, chief commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. And it's fair to say that Michael has huge, rich expertise in human rights, not only in the academic side, but also in practice on the ground in his work over the years. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Michael. And Michael, I'll hand over to you now to kickstart the discussion on this important topic.
David, thanks very much also for the introduction, and it's great to have been invited. Listen, nothing in my background prepared me for this. Your quote is bang on in terms of the sheer breadth, scale, implications, short and long term, of what the world is experiencing. How to frame it? Let me try and do that in a couple of minutes. The first is, I think the basic frame is that this is about a risk to life and health. And in the first place, the first human rights issue here is the duty on our states to take the necessary action to protect life and health. And we've seen a very uneven story of that across the world. Second, in the protection of life and health, it's inevitable that rights have to get restricted. And we're all experiencing it. We're all sitting at home because of one way or the other, this or that restriction on how we live, how we work, where we move, what we do, you name it. So it's a very, very wide range of rights. But we have to police that very carefully. And that's a second very important frame of managing this period, policing the restrictions to make sure that they comply with the really strict international law rulebook. I won't go into it now, but just for those less familiar with the legal side, ensuring that our powers that be represent the principles of legality. That was often violated here. Stuff got done without a legal base. Necessity, showing that this is the only way to do it. Proportionality, that it's not a sledgehammer crushing a nut, and that the principle of non-discrimination is assiduously honoured. We, by the way, I'll come back in the discussion to this if you like, but at the Fundamental Rights Agency, we're watching very carefully across the EU 27 states how they're doing in terms of applying those principles. But let me stay with, and I'll wrap up in a second, with the non-discrimination dimension. One of the most shocking aspects of COVID, it's often said, but it's absolutely central, is that this does not hit equally. There are massive inequalities in the experience of the pandemic and of the restrictions. There's an increasing convergence around the groups that are most impacted, at least in EU member states. And they are, it's not an exhaustive list, but they include, I think more accurate to say, people with disabilities, not just in institutions, detainees of one form or another, including prisoners, the homeless, victims of domestic violence, that crept up on us, older people. We've been sensitive to that since the very beginning, albeit I don't think we've done a very great job. And then the groups that are already the victims of hate. They're experiencing intensified hate. They're being blamed for the virus, and their general push to the edge of society is even more dramatic. One group, just to take an example, that preoccupies me is Roma and travellers, including in Ireland. And they are experiencing a perfect storm of human rights abuse, deprivation, and challenge. I could go through the examples of it. I'll just pick one. I'll just pick the one of a Roma child who's told to go home and distance learn. Distance learn in a home that doesn't have internet access. Distance learn when they don't have a tablet or a smartphone. Distance learn when there aren't the social supports for parental education support, because everybody's just scrambling to survive. I could go on, but I think that makes the point. And the last thing I'll say is that it's not all, by the way, a bad story. We've also seen increasingly over the last few months good practice emerging. Increasingly, the human rights machinery engaging with the big issues, the courts getting involved, parliaments getting more and more outspoken. This is encouraging. But DPAs, data protection authorities as well. But the last thing I'll say is, going forward, maybe the last element of my frame, this is not a short-term emergency. We all know we're far from being out of it yet, but even when we're out of it in terms of lockdowns, we're going to face the socioeconomic crisis. I'm not an economist, I just have to believe what I'm told, but we have a number of years to come of managing a big economic downturn with all of the implications that also will have for human rights, above all for the most vulnerable groups I've just mentioned. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. And we couldn't have had a better introduction to just the huge range of issues that have presented themselves over recent months. Obviously, there are certain new issues which are linked to COVID itself, but it's fair to say that the pandemic has also brought to the surface many underlying and ongoing challenges that we're facing here in Europe and around the world. You mentioned the importance of keeping the restrictions limited to what is necessary. One of the leading voices in this jurisdiction doing just that job is our next speaker. That's Herrick. Gleam is the Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. He's been a prominent voice questioning some of the restrictions that have been put in recent months, along with his colleagues at the ICCL, both on mainstream media and also on social media. Before taking up his current role, Liam has had a varied career in human rights and public policy, working as an advisor to President Michael D. Higgins, working as Executive Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust, and before that working in the Irish Human Rights Commission. So Liam has a rich background to bring to bear on this issue, and also that practical experience on the ground in challenging some of the practices that have developed in this jurisdiction in recent months. Liam, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, David. My signal might be dropping a little bit, so I'm just going to turn off the camera. It may help. Apologies for that. Michael very helpfully set out the human rights framework in terms of the principles of legality, necessity, proportionality, and non-discrimination, which give us a prism by which we as human rights activists can examine this whole question and the challenges that COVID presents. At the outset, in the Irish context, we very clearly stated that we didn't believe that the public health effort and protection of human rights were in conflict with one another, that they can be compatible if you take those standards and approach all government action from that perspective. But what we have seen is a number of specific challenges that have emerged here. First of all, we've seen very much unfettered executive power in terms of unprecedented powers on government, particularly the Minister for Health, to regulate family life, private life, movement in the country, international movement, business, work, people's religious practice, people's ability to protest. And that presents a lot of very significant challenges in a whole range of areas. We've seen government introducing surveillance measures around people's health, people's movement, people's contact with one another. And that was an example where, with the tracing app, the government actually put in place a lot of very good human rights protections. We've also seen initiatives about quarantine. We've seen recently criminal sanctions in relation to what people do in private homes, which again is something we've never seen in peacetime before in this country. And we've seen vulnerabilities in some sections of our population. Michael already alluded to some of the groups most at risk. In an Irish context, particularly asylum seekers, travellers, Roma, and people in nursing homes have been groups that have been especially vulnerable. Also, among the homeless population and the population of alcohol and drug users, we've seen some very positive steps being taken to protect them. So it's a mixed picture. But what I would say at this point in time, at the stage we're at now in the pandemic, there are a number of particular risks that we think are really increasing and becoming very much to the fore. One is a direct threat to the rule of law, which is we now have had embedded a practice by which the government is introducing new laws by ministerial order with no parliamentary oversight that actually speak directly to the private lives of citizens. A second threat is the temporary is becoming normalized and becoming more permanent. Particularly now, the regulations about dwelling events, visiting somebody else's house, are being introduced for longer and longer periods of time. I would say the threat that this poses in terms of normalizing state intervention in private life is very profound, and also the effect it has on the relationship between the police and the public. These are all threats that, when we now are going into longer periods, have to be seen in a very different light than the first sets of regulations that were only for matters of days or weeks. So from our perspective, we think the need to be vigilant is now is stronger. We think it's possible to maintain solidarity behind the public health effort and protect rights. But I think the longer it goes on, the risks increase. So I think really we're calling now for much stronger parliamentary oversight of the public health effort than we've seen up to this point. And we think that that's the next priority.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks for those insights, Liam. And one of the things that comes to mind in that context is how our public health legislation is really not suited to 2020. We're working on the basis here in Ireland, at least on the basis 1947 legislation, which has been amended somewhat, but really does seem designed for another time altogether. Our next speaker is Rujin Habibi, who's an international lawyer, consultant, and researcher specializing in global health law, governance, and justice. Rujin is a fellow and scholar at the Canadian International Council and the Global Strategy Lab at the University of Ottawa. She also teaches at Sydney University, covering different continents. I see, Rujin, very impressive, and has worked on the right to health at local and international level through civil society and intergovernmental organizations. So Rujin, we're looking forward to hear your perspective on this important debate.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for the invitation to Sofia. Thank you, Aminata. And also an excellent introduction from Michael and Liam. I'm I have to say, when I was trying to think about what to say on this vast topic, which is very important, but certainly one where one thinks, where should I begin? I think Michael and Liam have done an excellent job of really setting the stage. So thank you so much for that. What I wanted to emphasize in this talk is, I guess, where the niche or the neck of the woods that I come from, which is in health and health and human rights. And what we often say within the health and human rights community is that the two concepts, so health and human rights, are inextricably linked. And what we mean by that, and this is a proposition that first emerged during the HIV pandemic, that health. Well, what we mean by that is that an effective public health response to diseases like COVID-19 is also one that's rights-based. An effective health response to an individual's well-being is also a response that is rights-based. In turn, we also mean that public health at the population scale and health at the individual level is fundamental to reinforcing the human dignity and rights of all. So these are there's sort of a two-way road here where they're mutually reinforcing concepts. And so thinking about how the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated these inextricable linkages, I can sort of break it down into three core parts of the response to COVID-19. So the first part of that response is something we've already talked about a lot, which is restrictions on rights. So restrictions on your freedom of movement, restrictions on freedom of assembly, on your freedom of expression, on your privacy. These are all often implemented in the context of an emergency. And the reasoning for implementing them is not necessarily flawed. You do have there is a legitimate aim for many of these. In this case, in the COVID-19 pandemic, the purported legitimate aim is public health. However, even when they do have a legitimate aim, they do, as Michael and Liam have already alluded to and mentioned, they do have to be based on certain parameters. And those parameters include things like proportionality. So you need to have that balancing exercise. And certain rights, like the right to health, truly cannot be derogated from. So we just have to also bear that in mind, that there's some rights that you simply cannot curtail. The next area of the COVID-19 pandemic response is just more to the point, the right to health. And the right to health is, as many of you are likely aware, is often cited as Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, Social Rights, but it also finds its roots in some very, at the outset of the United Nations, it also found its roots. So in the Constitution of the World Health Organization, which goes back to 1940s, there is this right to health professed, and 196 countries are part of the WHO, or 194 states are part of the WHO. So there's that widespread understanding that the right to health is something states value. So the right to health includes those things like the intuitive things we might think about when we think about health, which is access to healthcare, access to health goods and facilities. But we not only need access, we need to also make sure that these are of acceptable and good enough quality. And so things like PPE, things that are the services that we've been lacking during the COVID-19 response, like PPE, like diagnostic testing, contact tracing, healthcare services for the most marginalized in the communities have all been sort of lacking in many contexts. Even when they are available to a certain population, they're certainly not available to all. And that's the non-discriminatory principle that not all states or many countries, if not all, are struggling with. And the final area of the response that I just want to touch on is international cooperation and assistance. So we've seen sort of this unprecedented call for global solidarity during this pandemic. That's something that comes from international human rights law as well, and under Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights, which calls for international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum available resources to help fulfill every individual's rights under the covenant. And so during the early stages of the pandemic, when countries like the UK start blocking export of PPE, when the USA likewise does the same. And then when you see international sanctions on countries like Iran that really go to the humanitarian supplies that are being submitted to them, you're seeing a failure in cooperation and assistance, especially in the early stages. But even now, I think the UK recently announced that they're going to cut back on ODA, overseas development assistance, And this is going to be necessary for the long run and recovery period of COVID-19. So it'd be interested in talking about those as further, but I'm going to stop there. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Regine. That was really interesting perspective. And last but not least, we've got our final speaker, István Hegedűs. István is the chairman of the Hungarian Europe Society, which is an NGO involved in international dialogue on the future of liberal democracies, a topic, as we know, of great importance in Europe today and around the world. Previously, István was a member of the Hungarian Parliament. He recently published an important piece for Carnegie Europe entitled Coronavirus and Democratic Erosion in Hungary. István, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Charlotte, Aminata, and David, and everybody for this invitation. As you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm somehow different. My presentation will be somewhat different to most of yours, but it's a real honor and challenge for me to participate in this high-level panel. Michael mentioned that there was an uneven field somehow between the member states in the European Union, and it was uneven in the sense that in Hungary we have a very special situation, as most of you probably know quite well. So when I now present problems which are it seems to be only detected mostly at national level in Hungary, I really hope that it will be not sound like very provincial for you, since I think that these particular challenges we face in Hungary are not just Hungarian problems, but really all European and maybe global issues. These challenges come mostly actually not from the pandemic, but these problems are caused by an illiberal populist regime, especially since in Hungary we have an anti-liberal political course in power. And this government, the Hungarian government, has already created a lot of turmoil and sometimes scandals inside the European Union, in the European public sphere, and as well as inside the European Union's decision-making process. So Hungary has been in the forefront of emerging populism, nationalism, nativism, whatever you call it. And I think you all know that Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has become an influential politician, even ideologist, and a troublemaker in the European political arena. And I am sure you all know that that is why I'm talking a little bit more about the background, because the backlash against the respect of fundamental rights, European values and principles, as well as regulations in an EU member state like Hungary, started much earlier, more or less 10 years ago. It happened in December 2010 when a storm of indignation broke out in the international media following the approval of restrictive media laws in Hungary. Jumping fast forward, just 3 or 4 years ago, when the government decided to push the Central European University out of the country, even a global outcry of the academic community trying to defend freedom of research and academic thinking was not able to block Orbán's intention to get rid of the liberal-minded, independent, and partly foreign-based higher education institution. In the meantime, during these 10 years, during that decade, Hungary's political system has been gradually moved towards a semi-authoritarian type of regime. Moreover, the internal divide, now not between rivals, but between enemies, has been extremely sharpened to a toxic level in domestic politics that involves ordinary citizens, hence the electorates of two hostile political camps. So the only question today in Hungarian politics has been simplified to this one: are you with Orbán or are you against him? Now, I think you understand in this political context why I'm speaking not only about the impact of pandemic. If I have time, I will try to do so as well. What's happening just now in the European Union, if you follow the news, is an unprecedented move once again. The Hungarian and the Polish governments threaten the European institutions and 25 member states to use their veto rights in order to block the approval of the multi-annual financial framework and the next generation EU program because they refuse to accept the new rule of law conditionality regime. This is an open attack against Article 2 of the EU Treaty, which shows that we have a serious and by now accumulated problem, which needs to be handled by the protagonists of the European idea and actually by the new US administration on the global stage as well, as soon as possible and with a strong determination finally. Just to show you the deepness of anti-European rhetoric in Hungary for domestic propaganda purposes, the ruling party Fidesz argues that Hungary would be punished through the fresh rule of law conditionality mechanism by bureaucrats in Brussels who support mass migration towards Europe, and that's why they want to undermine the national sovereignty of our country. The threat caused by the coronavirus certainly gave new impetus to the Hungarian leader to go on with his hidden agenda to concentrate power and to sideline the opposition, as well as to weaken what he calls the dominance of a liberal, secular, non-Christian, non-Hungarian, post-communist, globalist elite sponsored by a speculator in the background, the Hungarian-American billionaire and philanthrope George Soros. This frame has been spread in the pro-governmental media as a sort of fact, not as a conspiracy theory. Now, talking about the direct impact of COVID-19, during the first wave of the pandemic in the spring period, although Hungary was not so widely hit by the coronavirus, the government pushed through the parliament a new enabling act, giving new opportunity for Orbán to rule by decrees and without signaling any time limit. Interestingly, the government used this new option quite rarely in consequence of another protest wave that broke out inside the European Union. Actually, the government had another option, possessing an overwhelming two-thirds majority. Fidesz can easily change laws and the rule of the game without any real obstacles, relying simply on its parliamentary machinery. There was no ultimate reason for using the weapon that was the ruling by decrees. Since the parliament continued to work, held sessions, approved new laws, representatives of Fidesz preferred a well-orchestrated counterattack against foreign journalists and experts who said that they all had lied in their reporting about Hungary and the measures of the government. Nevertheless, a special law was approved for the emergency situation regarding the dissemination of so-called scaremongering. It proposed for perpetrators a maximum 5-year-long imprisonment. 2 suspects were really arrested in the following days, and although they were later released, the chilling effect of these drastic moves should not be underestimated. At the moment now, during the second wave of the pandemic, although the number of infections and death cases are much higher than in the spring, Fidesz simply changes the rules and the play field for the next general elections to be held in 2022, using its supermajority in the parliament, certainly neglecting the objections of the opposition parties. You see, this is the message of the government. Nobody rules by decrees. Hungary is a perfect democracy. Only our internal and foreign opponents who do not like us circulate lies about our country. I would argue that in our special case, at least as for Hungary, this is not the pandemic that has caused the most serious abuses of fundamental rights and a breach with the common European values and regulations. It is a populist, illiberal regime that threatens not only its own citizens, but the future of the European Union by spreading an ideological virus in the air. Thank you.
Thanks very much, István. That's a really interesting perspective, adding to the discussion, and it also emphasizes the real links between human rights issues, which too often can be seen in quite an individualistic way, and broader issues about democracy and the rule of law. And that's something that's touched upon in the other presentations too. I'm conscious of Liam's comments about how law is made restricting human rights, for example, in Ireland, and Michael's emphasis on the principle of legality. I wonder, does anybody want to come in on that issue in terms of maybe how robust have human rights been in the face of the pandemic, where we're faced with such systemic issues, both in the health system, but also in terms of public policy and governance? Michael?
Yeah, thanks. Not very robust, I think, is the answer. The pandemic arrived at a moment when things were already bad. You're just following what István said. The populism wasn't invented in 2020, and it's not just in any one particular country, and it has been eroding the human rights architecture for a number of years now, to a greater or lesser extent, depending where you go. And then I was struck. I continue to be struck, though I've been recently a little bit encouraged by the absence of human rights discourse from the decision-making table when it comes to these decisions. It certainly took time for the human rights voices to get loud enough to be heard and somehow to be factored into the equation. I've only come across 2 places. I could be wrong, there could be more in the EU, but we know of 2 countries where the human rights voice is explicitly in the COVID-related decision-making. That's Luxembourg and Finland. Now, there may be more, but we haven't come across a lot. That doesn't say much good for how well the human rights actors have positioned themselves and how well they've been allowed to position themselves to be at the center of decision making. That's a lesson we have to learn going forward. And I just want to echo, and I'll stop with this. I want to echo something that Liam said about the temporary becoming normalized. And to put the same point in another way, we have to be extremely vigilant to avoid the 9/11 effect. Post 9/11 effect. We saw how erosion of human rights became standardized, normalized in the context of the terrorist threat of September 11. We're at risk of something analogous happening here if we're not extremely vigilant and be very loud. And again, here I think the role of national human rights institutions, human rights commissions, data protection authorities, that whole family of machinery has to really grab this opportunity and not waste it.
Thanks, Michael. And Liam, you might pick up the baton on that, because that's certainly a feature of the debate here in Ireland. Obviously, in March, when the then Taoiseach made his statement from Washington, in fact, announcing the first wave of restrictions, there was the urgency. This was a challenge that had to be tackled with immediacy. But we're now months on into this. To what extent has the system here, at least, responded to that in the ways that Michael has talked?
I think, David, ICCL and colleagues in the Trinity Observatory and others as well have been strongly arguing that it's in the government's interest to have transparent processes of showing why they're doing what they're doing and why restrictions on certain rights are necessary and are proportionate. And if they were to do that, if there were better safeguards and processes in place, it would strengthen public support and solidarity for the public health effort. And we've been trying to be helpful by suggesting this, but without success. The difficulty I see is that the failure to do that, to do what Michael has said is happening in Finland and Luxembourg, Finland particularly being a country that's been very successful on the health side of things as well, is in the absence of that, when the restrictions on rights do happen, you are giving a real bane to far-right populist groups that would seek to use COVID as a wedge issue, which is what we're seeing in the United States and we're seeing in Europe as well. So we see far-right groups positioning themselves as the defenders of civil liberties, human rights, free speech, the right to protest in a completely cynical way. But there's a vacuum in which they're being allowed to do that. And I think that is a failing. Now, in Ireland, you know, the risks haven't been huge and we have managed it. And because our, you know, the restrictions here are not in the malign political climate that István has talked about, but it's still risks, and they're unnecessary risks. And I think it's something we really do need to address. We've been making this point. I think the Department of Justice, the guards are very sympathetic towards this. They understand the sensitivities here, but the people making decisions in the public health space are not looking at these rule of law issues in that light.
And I think, Liam, that's a fair characterization of the position. You can understand in the immediate onset period a pretty one-dimensional focus. And over time, the dimensions have increased a little bit, but it's tended to be about balancing health on the one hand and the economy on the other hand, without the human rights picture or the broader implications being factored in to the analysis. Rougine, I wonder, is this a feature outside Ireland and the European Union that you've come across in your work?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's, I've seen it across the board in Canada and the United States. It's just this general lack of emphasis on human rights in public decision-making, but also in public participation. So, I mean, we've spoken about transparency, but also, you know, those who are furthest left behind, the elderly, their voices are not reflected in the policymaking process. And there's certainly ways to do that through consultations with these groups, with the subpopulations, with the most marginalized, what they need. And that's not something that I'm seeing in Canada, at the very least. And then also just to this issue of populism, I fully agree, Liam, with your point around it being sort of the civil liberties component of this pandemic getting co-opted almost by a right-wing movement that really. So just looking at the United States and Canada, for instance, just wearing a mask has become so politicized, and it need not be that the case. But it's suddenly a bodily autonomy issue now, and so really hindering the response as well.
And as we know, nuance doesn't find a comfortable home in the public debate around these issues a lot of the time. István, Michael and others have emphasized that while the picture is bleak in many respects, there are also some glimmers of light. I'm wondering, in the Hungarian context, have you seen much positive come from some of the debates brought on by the pandemic that kind of counterbalance the picture somewhat?
Well, I have to think about it, but I want to say that in a sense, maybe that's the good news, because populists are in power in Hungary, and I think the picture is similar in Poland. These two governments try to behave somewhat differently compared to Brazil's Bolsonaro or Donald Trump's behavior regarding whether to wear a mask or not. So they try not to over-politicize the issue. So the whole debate in Hungary, we still have an opposition, and in the free part of the media or on the internet, you have counter arguments to be read. So it's not a full-fledged dictatorship. So I don't want to say that it's Turkey or Russia, still not, or maybe not at all. So you have some debates, and the debate is mostly, interestingly, about policy issues, because the healthcare system is in such a bad shape in Hungary. So the real debate is whether the hospitalization of the people can be solved, whether there are enough ventilators. And in a strange way, a panicking government actually bought too many ventilators, and it cost a huge amount of money when this government bought from all over the world, from China and mostly from the East, 100,000 ventilators instead of 10,000. So there is a scandal which actually still shows the problems of a populist regime, that there is no transparency. Only some investigative journalists found out how much did it cost to the Hungarian taxpayers, and very likely it's also a corruption issue. And now the government tries to sell these ventilators to third countries. So, but what I want to say, maybe because it's a problem of credibility and whether the government is able to manage this crisis at all, it's not over ideologized in the case of Hungary, and I guess it's the same in Poland as well.
And István, do you have any sense, have the EU institutions, which have been much criticized in their response to the situation in Hungary and also Poland, have they had any effect on the public debate? Has there been any positive influence in that respect coming from Brussels, for example?
Yeah, sure. The opposition parties who are somehow more united now than last year or 2 years ago had a joint communique, for example, saying that Orban does not represent Hungary when he doesn't want to sign the agreement on the conditionality of the rule of law regime, but the other part of Hungary, represented by half of the people, by the opposition who represent half of the people, according to the polls, would certainly support an all-European solution regarding human rights issues, regarding migration, regarding other policy issues at European level. So there is, in principle, an alternative to the current regime, at least.
Okay, thanks very much for that, István. One thing that struck me over the past few months, and this is certainly a feature of the debate here in Ireland, but I think it's something we see elsewhere, is that in one sense, COVID has been a little bit of a leveler. For example, in some of the public policy responses here, we've made social benefits available much more widely, healthcare similarly, and so on. And I wonder, and it's also broken down to some extent, now I don't want to overstate this, the division that, at least in Ireland, is so firmly fixed between civil and political rights on the one hand and socio-economic rights on the other hand. I wonder, do any of the panelists think that there's scope for more positive work in that respect on the basis of what we've seen over the past 9 months or so? I don't know if anybody would want to. Michael? Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I won't speak so much to the Irish setting. I think Liam and yourself and others are better placed to do that. But what we found is that the whole COVID disaster has focused on groups that were otherwise neglected, and it was very hard to get attention to. Roma is a really good example. I see more reference to Roma in the we keep track of the media with these things, and there's definitely a significant rise in sympathetic analysis of the Roma situation, which is really very rare and unusual. But of course, we have to work with that now. It isn't going to turn into something positive and good all on its own. Older people. I get a sense that this year we had a quantum leap and a wake up to the extent to which older people are excluded from decision making. I remember, what's his name, Charlie Bird, during the cocooning back in the first phase. He was fantastic on radio, but he was fantastic also in bringing a forgotten community back into the room. Now, you'll tell me, you're better placed than me as to whether, I don't think they did cocooning again in this second round. So that was a learning from then. So, but then there's another thing, and I don't know, I don't want to exaggerate causality, but I have a sense that we wouldn't have had the Black Lives Matter phenomenon if it weren't for the extraordinary situation we found ourselves in 2020. And again, I think I'm in danger here of expressing too close a link between the phenomena, but nevertheless, it created a space where we were able to make remarkable progress. Here in the EU setting, within weeks, the European Commission was able to put in place an anti-racism action plan that had never existed before and emerged entirely out of the Black Lives Matter phenomenon and wouldn't have gained the traction were it not for it happening in the COVID context. So there are consequences and unintended parallel threads with which we have to work. But you know, it's easy to talk about them, but we have to work with them. They're not going to turn into goods all on their own. And we have to be extremely smart in the way we frame our messages. I'll stop with one thought. Look, it's great that people are talking about the socioeconomic side as well as the civil and political side, but they're not talking about them as rights. You know, I've yet to turn on my Morning Ireland in the morning and hear the rollout of social welfare to new groups as it being about delivering on their human rights. We have to make that connection and help people understand what Rujin spoke about, the rights-based approach, and how the rights-based approach is a legitimate public policy choice which leads to better outcomes. That's the next challenge.
Thanks, Michael. Rujin, do you want to come in on that, just in terms of the right to health and what we've understood about it, and how maybe we've seen some evolution over the past year?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So yeah, I completely agree that there has been sort of this this exposure, this greater public, I guess, enlightenment around the ways that our society is divided and the fault lines of it, I guess, if you will. But you know, and we're hearing like catchword terms like building back better, building back equal, you know, all of these kind of easy to throw statements, and that's all well and good. But I completely agree with what Michael has just said, which is that you know, these socioeconomic, I guess, entitlements are not being discussed as rights. They're not being framed as such in the general public knowledge. And also, like in Canada, we have very substantial problems still around data collection around how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted some of our most marginalized. So we still struggle to collect race-based data, you know, and that's very, you know, just even understanding the scope of the problem is huge and very important to having that public health response be robust. And so that's all part of the rights-based approach to it, to understand that these groups exist and how are the measures affecting them. And while I hear that in Ireland, you may have still ongoing sort of social security measures in place, you know, in Canada, after I think the first 3 months or 4 months of the pandemic, it was gone. And you know, now our frontline workers have to decide between either going to work or not having an income and staying at home. Which is an enormously difficult decision to make, you know, and now that it's no wonder that in Canada we're seeing our second lockdown already. Well, at least in Toronto, where I'm based, we're seeing our second lockdown already. So yeah, absolutely, there's a lot to unpack there.
There is indeed. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that. Liam?
Yeah, I mean, if I could be positive, first of all, I think there's some issues where there's progress that's been made that probably is irreversible, such as emphatically showing that things like direct provision are not tolerable, and it will hasten the end of direct provision of asylum seekers. I think it probably will lead to greater accountability and oversight of nursing homes, and that's consistent with things like ratification of OPCAT and having inspection there. I think that will happen. What might happen in terms of discourse is that issues such as like the right to protest or even the right to worship are becoming more cleanly defined. You know, we see now what it's like to have the right to protest taken away or the right to religious observance taken away. And I think it does serve that purpose. But the real prize is to recalibrate how we think about income, healthcare, and housing, and translating the really positive things that happened in the short term here into long-term structural change is a big challenge. I think there's some positive signs. I mean, we are now talking about a right to housing in the Constitution. We are now talking about basic income in one sector of the economy for artists, which could lead to a wider discussion there. And we are talking about bans and evictions, you know, in a longer term. So, but I think there's a long way to go on that. Like, for example, we had universal healthcare for a few months. I don't think we're going to hold on to that, you know? So I think that there are definitely some achievements though.
Liam, I'm just struck by that, particularly when it comes to the right to protest, which has been a victim of COVID in a big way, the right to worship as well. But connecting it back to something you mentioned before, where certain of the most vocal elements in the community have been coming from a place of maybe more abuse of human rights or human rights skepticism, is there a risk of too much of of a backlash in certain contexts where particular rights such as protest and worship are being maybe invoked by particular individuals and groups who are not liked and therefore can be all too easily dismissed, whether by politicians, the courts, or public opinion more generally?
I think in an Irish context, what's been positive is that even though it hasn't been provided for in law, that protest is a reasonable excuse to have movement, for example. It could have been, as it was in Israel and some other countries. It has been implicit from the police and from the state that the right to protest must be defended even in a public health crisis. That's very, very positive. Yes, there have been some groups that have abused the right and have had protests in an unsafe way. And we have sought to try to distinguish in calling on guidelines for how to have a safe protest. That's one of the things we've been doing as an organization. So there are some risks, but I think, in the longer term, that strong state commitment to the right to protest, even in a pandemic, is very, very valuable. And I think we need to take the positive element of that.
Okay, thanks for that, Liam. I might just wrap up the general discussion with one final issue for us to consider and then take questions and answers. And that issue is, what big human rights issues are we facing in the next phase of this pandemic? So over the past month, there's been a little bit of positivity with talk of vaccine and so on. Issues around access to the vaccine are going to loom very large very quickly. I'm interested to hear what the panelists think the big issues we face in the next phase are. I don't know who wants. István, do you want to kick us off on that, or come to you, Michael? I know you need to leave us in a few minutes.
Just go ahead then. I can stay longer. Yeah, I can wait. Or you want me to continue?
Yeah, if you just want to address that briefly, and we'll do a tour de table.
Sure. I have just one issue in my mind, that is the problem of virus deniers, because we also have some, and there was a debate whether such people are allowed to speak on big TV networks to spread their views, or whether we should create a sort of cordon sanitaire. And this debate has not been decided. It's not the other debate between populists and non-populists. It's a more general human rights or freedom of expression debate. And I myself, I have no real idea what is more correct or not. But this is a problem because some people who got the virus and suffered under the disease started to attack those who are virus deniers, that you should come to the hospital and stay with me for 5 more days and you will see what you are talking about. And I'm not quite sure what is the correct reaction. Certainly it's a very dangerous situation when many people believe in the way of thinking of virus deniers. But you might tell me where freedom of speech starts and where it ends in such a critical situation like all of us have today.
Thanks, István, and that's a really good example of some of the really difficult clashes that we've seen, very complex competing interests. Michael, I wonder what your thoughts are on the next phase, what the big human rights issues you see coming down the line are.
Yeah, sure. But just a sentence on this issue of the deniers and all that stuff that we heard about just now. Look, I just want to say one thing there without jumping in too deeply into it. We who work in human rights have been confronted also by the need to stand up and defend people with whom we profoundly disagree. And we have to do that. As long as, as long as their case is legitimate, then we have to stick up for that. I'm not saying every claim and every demand is legitimate, of course. I'm just saying that to be treated like the more agreeable rights holders. The two big issues for me. The first is human rights compliance by the private sector. We haven't discussed it yet, but the business world is huge to the future, including taking up Rujan's point about international cooperation. That's predominantly a business of international corporations these days, arguably more than states. And so we have to do a quantum leap in human rights compliance on the part of business. And closely related, secondly and finally, we another quantum leap, if you will, has to be with regard to human rights compliance in the digitalization of our lives. The digital world became huge this year in ways we couldn't have believed possible, and we're still in frontier territory in terms of mapping out the human rights implications. So they, for me, would be two of the principal challenges going forward.
And of course, Michael, I think it's fair to say that those two challenges are intimately interconnected,
Absolutely.
given the power of big tech, which we've really seen exposed in a big way, particularly over the last few months. Rujin, do you want to come in on that? What do you see as the next challenges in the next phase?
Yeah, well, I think all of those, I've lost count of how many were mentioned, but all of those are super important. And I guess I'll mention the most obvious one, maybe you've already alluded to it a bit, is just the vaccine access. Like, getting that into all the communities in every country, in the lower middle income countries in particular, as richer countries start to cope with the problem, right? And they feel safe and all well and good. Will we see the same thing that happened with the HIV pandemic, which, you know, suddenly access to medicines was a total blockage. And, you know, so Africa in particular fell really far behind in responding to the epidemic. So we're seeing that lower middle income countries are actually doing well in addressing the pandemic right now, but it's a long protracted road for them, and in particular will require access. So making sure that coverage is gained around the world will mean that the whole world is ultimately safe. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, and for governments to not lose that long-sighted vision of it.
Thanks, Rujin. That's really helpful. And I'm just struck by however challenging the issues of social and economic equity are at the national level, at the international level, they're just so much more acute. Liam, I wonder what you see as the big challenges coming down the line are in the next phase.
I'd agree with what Regina just said. I mean, this question of vaccine sovereignty for wealthy countries here, it's crept into the discourse a little bit. The Irish government have spoken a bit about EU states' responsibilities towards lower middle income countries. If the vaccine progresses, that'll be the issue. If the vaccine didn't progress, or for any reason, I think we are it's just about coming at the right time for us, because we are now at the stage where this tension between business and vulnerable sections of the population is really hitting a crux point. And if the vaccine comes in the early part of 2021, maybe we'll avoid it. But I think we are now at a very divisive discourse between the interests of the economy and the interests of those that are most affected by, because obviously we're at the point as a country we can't afford the kind of lockdown measures for very much longer. You know, we're at the point of running out of money. So I think it might be coming in time, and I hope it is. And I think we should be having, as a country which produces a lot of pharmaceutics here, we might have a particular moral responsibility and maybe even legal responsibilities to address this issue of sovereignty.
Thanks very much, Liam. And I think Michael has to leave us now, but before he does, I'd just like to extend our thanks to Michael for participating this evening, and to compliment him and his team at the FRA for all the important work they've been doing in holding EU institutions and the member states to account. So keep up the good work, Michael. And thanks a million for joining us. I don't know if anybody in the audience has any questions at this stage. Liam, Rujin and István have kindly agreed to stay with us, but please, if you do have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and speak, or else just put it into the chat box. This is your opportunity to participate, and we'd like it to be an interactive event rather than just ourselves speaking. Anybody want to
have a question, actually. I can't actually raise my hand because I'm a host. Sorry about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So actually, it's something Michael mentioned about businesses complying and that sort of thing. And I read something about Qantas Airlines the other day, talking about once there was a vaccine that they and other airlines would make it obligatory to be vaccinated in order to fly. But obviously, there's the issue about you know, vaccines are probably not going to be available for everyone. A, there's the availability of them. B, there's the cost. So how realistic really is that? And is that not really going to be you know, I mean, that's going to be potentially a major issue for human rights in the future, and what is your view on this, and how do you see this going forward, I guess is my question.
Thanks, Charlotte. Anybody want to take up that challenging question?
Sure, I can just provide a first response. I think that's an excellent question, and actually I think I heard that as well 2 or 3 days ago, and remembered thinking, okay, this is going to be a new contentious topic to deal with in moving forward with the pandemic. So, you know, the notion of the vaccine not being available is exactly right. So, you know, the way that the WHO's allocation system is currently being proposed is that the vaccine gets given to 20% of every country in the world. So every country in the world has, for instance, its most vulnerable, the elderly, frontline workers, you know, taken care of first with the vaccine. Then you kind of, as the supply chain builds up, you start to give out to other members of the population. If that's the approach that we take, certainly that will not be a realistic approach. But of course, it also, you know, has implications for discrimination, and whether you're not letting certain people get on a plane because they haven't vaccinated, because they don't have access to it, because they're from a certain community, and so that has definitely very challenging ethical implications that I'm not sure that the international bodies have dealt with in enough detail, or in that the issue merits. But there is a good article around this in the Lancet. It's by Alexandra Phelan, and I would recommend you look it up. It's not about vaccine testing in airplanes, and I'll write her name as well in the chat, but it's more so about immunity passports generally. So in all aspects of society, if we're going to block people who are vaccinated from accessing services, the ethical implications of that are far-reaching. And I'll also type her name. Oh, I think David found it. Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks
for that, Regine. That sounds like an interesting article on that topic, and it's been interesting how the debate even has evolved in recent weeks. You know, the joy that greeted the first vaccine, then similarly as new vaccines have come out, and then with the Oxford one, a little bit of disappointment initially in terms of the numbers being slightly low, and then the emphasis by the Oxford team on that wider provision problem. And I wonder who's going to take up the mantle there, and how the WHO is going to show leadership on that and so on. Wonder, Gleam and István, do you have any thoughts on that? And István, I see we've got a specific question for you here from Oliver. What are the chances, or what would it take for Orbán to back down over the EU spending plan and stimulus packages rule of law clause?
Well, there are many scenarios potentially we can imagine in case, and I hope so, the European institutions would not give any real concession to Orbán. He might, accept an idea that the European Court of Justice might have a stronger role in this debate about rule of law conditionality. So Hungary or Poland might go easier to the European Court of Justice to ask for its opinion. I'm not sure whether that's enough for Orbán, because maybe the European Court of Justice would agree that there are problems in Hungary spending, the EU budget. So that's maybe one way out, maybe with a sort of declaration of the EU leaders, I don't know what will be in that declaration, but the text might be maybe a little bit more fluid, and then Orbán might come home to Hungary saying, I won. But that I don't know. The other scenario is certainly in case he and maybe his Polish friends are going to veto this, then we don't know what will happen. One way out is that the 25 other member states would create a sort of special enhanced cooperation, and then we are out, which is a tragedy for Hungary and maybe too much risk for Orbán to lose so much money. And the opposition might now finally use the European card against him. And also, in case he vetoes together with the Poles, the European People's Party finally might kick out Orbán from the center-right political family inside the European Parliament and in the EU generally, which might be the outcome sooner or later anyway, but still, for Orbán, it was a sort of, good excuse that he is still inside the mainstream. So I wouldn't be in the place of Orban. I think this is not a win-win situation for him at the moment. And I really hope that European leaders will be tough and won't give any concession and water down the whole process or conditionality frame, because that's the end of the story. It has no sense. Then what have we done so far? So we will see.
Thanks, István. That's one to watch, definitely. I see that Bani has a question. Bani, do you want to come in? I'm asking you to unmute. You should be able to join us now.
Yeah. So my question is kind of about, so I'm Indian, and in India, we also have like a right-wing populist in power, and he's used the lockdowns and the pandemic in a sense to arrest a lot of his political enemies. And there's like people my age, students like me who protested, who are now in jail, and the lockdowns have kind of been used, you know, to pass media laws, to like bring things under the information ministry, etc. So like, just in light of that, with the discussion we've had about Hungary and other countries like Brazil and Turkey, do you think that the pandemic could potentially be one of those crises that is used, I suppose, when we look back in history, or even when we look into politics, as a crisis which could help the backsliding of democracy even more than, you know, to be used to exacerbate or like cement the power of these populists? I know we brushed upon this, but I just wanted to like ask more in detail. Yeah,
that's a really good question, Bani, and I think it also picks up on something that Michael was talking about as well in terms of digitalization and all the rest. I was in India, in fact, last New Year, and there was a huge debate there about some of the data protection legislation and the various measures that were being undertaken by the government at that time, long before COVID. So I can understand how those issues would be of increasing concern now. Liam, Rujin, István, anybody want to come in on that issue? Gleam? Thanks.
I mean, we're definitely seeing it in some countries. We are part of an international network of civil liberties organizations with Canadian CCLA, the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, and also we have an Egyptian partner. And in Egypt this week, there has been a very aggressive clampdown on human rights organizations. So I think in already authoritarian states, and India, we have colleagues in India as well, we are certainly seeing that. You know, it doesn't seem to have been adopted in the more semi-democratic states, you know. There were certainly some worrying signs in Israel, but not very significant, and there was legal reaction to that. So I think definitely there's examples of authoritarians using this, but not necessarily countries sliding into authoritarianism. That's a very big generalization, but that's just the perspective we're seeing from our colleagues.
Thanks, Liam. Any further thoughts on that, Regina or István? I see we've got a question from Rosemary. Following on from Bani's question, do you think the pandemic has strong implications for international attention on human rights? For example, the public outcry over Hong Kong democratic rights has died down as democratic states are more focused on their issues related to the pandemic. So I suppose, and that raises a broader issue, folks, about, you know, the potential for the pandemic to mask important human rights issues. Any thoughts on that, Rujin, maybe, or István? Yeah.
Yeah, I just would like to mention that maybe the outcome of the US presidential election might give us hope that multilateralism, international issues will become on the agenda once again, and not only America first rhetoric will dominate the scene. And in that sense, Joe Biden has a plan, in spite of this pandemic, it was created this year, to bring together a summit for democracies. And here he and some like-minded people want to talk about human rights and fundamental rights and rule of law. So I think the pressure from the United States, at least, will be increased towards authoritarian governments and measures of these governments. I think it's not a miracle what we might expect from that change, but the general mood, atmosphere in the international politics might change, and this is a good step forward.
That's an important point, István, and obviously in terms of the broader international system, international cooperation, which Regine has talked about, that has the potential to be a big change. We've seen how the WHO has been undermined in recent times. When you think of the broader issues, human rights issues around climate change, that has been significantly undermined in the past few years, and obviously closer to home issues around Brexit as well. Anybody else want to speak to that issue, or just how the perspective looks now after the November election in the US, without being too US focused? Regine, you're close enough to the border there. How is it looking from Canada?
Unfortunately. Well, I think it's certainly very positive that Joe Biden's been elected, that there's this whole rhetoric of America's back in global health, America's going to play a leading role. But my fear has been, and since Donald Trump came into power, my fear and my worry with the international order as it stands is that it should have never been so centric on the United States in the first place, such that a sudden government change could influence the world so gravely. And so I think one thing that would have been really, that I hope countries around the world take and governments around the world take and move forward with, is that do not always depend on the United States to be the good actor in the world. Do your part in contributing as much as you can to leading in. So for instance, we've seen Germany, for instance, rise up and take some leadership role at the WHO and in global health. But we need to see many more countries kind of rallying around and building a block around these kinds of issues. So it's certainly not the panacea, however you pronounce the word. I've always read it, I've never actually said it, but it's certainly not that all curable solution. And I worry as well that Donald Trump is going to run again in 2024. So it's not a problem that's ever over. He had more votes in the United States than ever before. And that should be, telling. Almost 50% of the population voted for him. So that's just the climate is not always conducive.
That's a very a good point, and I think the word that Liam used earlier really cuts across so much of this, the need for vigilance on all fronts. There's a few questions here in the chat. I might just take them one by one, unless anybody wants to come in on that. Phoebe asked, just with regard to what Regine said about how the right to health was a very important right. Obviously, the measures taken by the government in relation to the virus are very valid and needed, i.e. lockdown, social distancing. This unfortunately tends to have a negative effect on business, especially smaller businesses, where they can't afford these lockdowns, and being shut down for weeks impacts their livelihood catastrophically. At what point does the right to earn a livelihood come into play? Anybody want to take up that issue that Phoebe raises, which again, it's that kind of dimension that I think we're going to hear about a lot as we start to emerge from the second wave of lockdowns. And we're having that debate here in Ireland already, certainly.
Yeah.
Liam,
I'll take a...
Oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No. I can take a first shot at it, and then I'd love for others to build on it, because it is a very complex, it is the question, I think, right now as we're dealing with the pandemic is just who's, who do you want to impact the most, and who is going to be impacted the most by the measures. So, in countries that reacted very well, very strongly at the very beginning with measures for all for all subpopulations of all ranks of their society, the impact and the response was effective. And so those countries are now no longer having to contemplate a second lockdown. However, for countries where the response was muted or half-hearted, or where there were certain populations left behind, you're seeing the resurgence of the pandemic starting from those communities, but also now spreading across those other communities that we're looking at. And so the right to livelihood is an underlying determinant of the right to health. So we have to bear in mind that as we're talking about making a rights-based approach to the pandemic response and having a rights-based approach to health, we're also talking about making sure people have enough to earn a livelihood, enough to eat, enough to drink. These are the underlying factors. And so there's definitely a balancing act that has to come into play. The vaccine can't come soon enough, I guess, is what I would end with here. But I'm also open to thoughts from Liam.
And also the right to health regime encompasses the right to mental health as well. And a lot of people have been making more of that as the human impact of the pandemic has been felt by individuals out of work and disconnected from society and so on. Liam, I wonder what your views are on that thorny issue.
Yeah. As I said before, I mean, I think the vaccine is coming.
But the line's a little bit off,
Liam,
sorry.
I just switched the camera off. I hope that that's a little bit better.
Yeah,
but
we can check it out.
I think it's certainly better to have a public health led approach than not to have a public health led approach like we had in the US, where public health wasn't given a strong enough voice. But I think it's equally important that we have a broad multidisciplinary view of public health. In Ireland, if there is a failing, it's been a very narrow, contagion-focused approach, which was definitely optimum in the early phase, but is inadequate as you go forward, you know, to take into account mental health and wider considerations. And I think the ideal is that you have a multidisciplinary decision-making framework where economic and social, and we would say human rights impacts are properly weighed up. Like there's been a limitation to what we've done here, is that it's a narrow public health and then everything else, which is mainly economically focused as the balance, you know, that the amount of perspectives isn't as broad as it should be. And I'd like to think that we should prepare ourselves a little bit better for the next time by putting in place a better decision-making matrix around it.
Thanks, Liam. We're going to send that on to NEFIT and see what they have to say.
We've been writing to the Department of Health on this since April, and they're not going to listen to us at this stage, I don't think, you know.
And what form do you think that might take, Gleam, or where might it come into the process?
Well, what we've been struck by is, like Michael gave examples of countries that have human rights expertise built into the public health decision-making. In Australia and New Zealand, they've kind of got economic and sociological input. France, I think, similarly, its expert body had a broader remit as well. Even here, you could keep NEFIT as it is, as a public health body, but a little bit broader public health perspectives, and then also have a decision-making forum short of government that economic and social interests fed into. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of months is it's NEFIT, and then it goes into cabinet, which is about horse trading and which interest groups has a loudest voice, like the publicans or, you know, the retail sector.
Yeah.
So I think that there are better ways of doing it than we've had it. But I mean, it's still better to have public health in the driving seat than to have business in the driving seat. You know, they're not equal here.
Yeah. And one thing that struck me, and this is an Irish thing, but I think it's of broader relevance, is in Ireland we have this not very well known public sector duty, which encompasses both equality and human rights. And that public sector duty imposes a positive obligation on public bodies to take human rights and equality into account in their decision making. And from what I can see, while IRIC has produced some guidance around it, it's had very little real impact at this time when we've seen the most far-reaching measures restricting rights and also raising important discrimination issues. Just a few questions here. Charlotte asks, I've noticed an anti-compulsory vaccine group recently holding a small protest in Dublin. In general, what would be the correct government response to hospital or care home personnel refusing COVID vaccinations in the new year? So what if somebody who's working in the health sector wanted to refuse vaccination? Complex legal and ethical issues there. Anybody want to take that one before we go on to the... Sarah has a related issue. As Charlotte mentions above, I was just wondering how the right to bodily integrity might come into play once vaccines come out, and in particular in relation to people who are anti-vax. Liam, I think you were kindly volunteering to come in on that one.
I think Ruchin probably has a lot more expertise than I do, but I think there's a misnomer here in terms of the mandatory vaccine debate in Ireland. You know, there's strong constitutional protections that would make a mandatory vaccine program difficult. And I wouldn't be convinced, and I'd be interested in Rujan's view, I'm not convinced it's necessarily very good public health policy to make vaccines mandatory. What's very likely here is that there'll be a very strong uptake. And the question would be to actually meet the demand with the supply. But I don't think mandatory vaccine is a likely prospect here. And I don't think it's likely to become a problem. The question of requiring vaccine to work in certain areas will be a very tricky ethical question.
Or go to school.
Yeah. I think the immunity passport question is hugely fraught. And I think that's a big concern within the European Union, that some states that are more comfortable with centrally driven public health policy of that type might pilot it, you know. But I think here it's not really consistent with our approach to public health.
Rujan, I'll come to you in a minute. István, I'm just wondering, what's the Hungarian perspective on that in terms of talk of mandatory vaccination? Is that something that's been discussed, or how's that being approached in Hungary?
Well, there was not much debate as far as I know, but the government already proclaimed that vaccination will not be obligatory, but you might choose. What I don't really understand as a citizen, what they think. I think that a big part of the population should be vaccinated to get real defense against the virus in all countries. So it's again for me a clash between individual rights and the rights of the community. What is the first one? And as a citizen who wants to be, vaccinated as soon as possible, and I want to travel, and I don't want any restrictions traveling and so on. So what will be the outcome in case not enough people, maybe theoretically only, will not be vaccinated? But as far as I understand, the government is quite liberal from that perspective, and it won't be obligatory.
Okay, thanks for that, István. Rujan, do you want to come in on that? How do you see that playing out? It may very well be that we see different approaches across different countries, raising problems for international cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with Liam that I think that in the context of at least liberal democracies or countries like Canada, countries like Ireland and others, it's going to be very challenging to impose a mandatory vaccine mandate. In Canada as well, constitutionally challenging. I guess the best strategy to getting vaccine uptake is building public trust, right? To make sure that the public actually trusts the science that's leading to this vaccine. And unfortunately, what we've seen is, well, I know from my neck of the woods being close to the United States, how Donald Trump has handled that process has been very flawed, in that he's essentially weakened institutions like the FDA, like the CDC. These are like public health institutions that are supposed to be giving independent, partial, strong, robust scientific advice to the government. And when you weaken those, and when you fast track approval for certain treatments without any really, just because a president ordered that it be so, is not a recipe for building public trust. The other issue that I'm seeing right now is that we're seeing really promising vaccine results, but they're being put out by press release. And this is something that people are calling like results by press release, in the sense that data is not actually being publicized. It's not actually, by the companies, neither AstraZeneca, nor Pfizer, nor Moderna, none of those have actually made publicly available their data so that scientists can independently view what it is that's actually being shown to be effective, because it may not be actually, the indicator for effectiveness may not necessarily be preventing the disease. It may be something just before that, so in the biological pathway. That's really important as well. So building public trust is key. Also, my hope is that through herd immunity, slowly, as many of the other members of the population take it up, you kind of start to avoid the issue of infringing on people's bodily autonomy to have a mandatory vaccine. But I'd be interested to see as well if the centralized governments or authoritarian governments like China, for instance, will be able to do something like that, and what result they have.
Thanks, Eugene. That's a really interesting question. And I think it touches on one of the really important overarching points here. And it's something that you've all mentioned in various ways, just how rights are a critical part of this debate, too often neglected over the last few months. But the relationship with public trust is really critical. And I think here in Ireland in recent weeks, we've seen a little bit of that. Liam might correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just conscious of the kind of rushed reaction, for example, to ban takeaway pints, and the guards coming in and saying, no, or at least the impression was, back off. This isn't going to be helpful. This is going to damage public trust. Liam, what's your sense of that in terms of what state public trust is in after the last few months, and how it might play out in terms of bringing people on board over the next few months?
I mean, overall in Ireland, all of the research suggests very high levels of trust in the public health authorities, which is positive, you know, and I think we're very fortuitous. It's fortuitous that that's the case. We would say that reactionary decision-making, overstretching authoritarian kind of measures can damage that. It's a very peculiar dynamic we've got here, David, that one of the voices that's actually been moderating this has been the police and the justice. As a civil liberties organization in existence for nearly 50 years, you know, our biggest
They're normally
concern,
on the receiving end of your tongue, Liam.
Yeah, it's about, you know, criminal justice agencies wanting more powers, wanting more resources. That's not been the case here. They have actually been mindful of their relationship with the community, and they're thinking about the fact that when all of this is over, they'll want to have constructive relationships, particularly with marginalized communities. So there are some dangers in that, but the trust is high, and that is good, and that makes all of these questions about vaccines and compliance with public health measures much better. What we've been saying, though, is that the most effective measures from a behavioral perspective and a criminological perspective are simple, strong messages encouraging compliance, explaining why it's necessary, and social solidarity. And you can't commit to that on one hand and then threaten people with prosecutions, fines, and punishment on the other. You know, there's an inconsistency there, and that's where I think our approach is a bit weak. The good thing is that the government has made a lot of bad decisions about criminalizing things it didn't need to criminalize, but the police have taken a moderate approach and basically ignored them and not enforced them. So that's been a check.
Very good. Not necessarily how you design it, but an important feature nonetheless. I'm going to take us all back to a super spreader event. I don't know if anybody remembers that nice ceremony in the Rose Garden of the White House when President Trump unveiled his new Justice of the Supreme Court to the world, Amy Coney Barrett. And we haven't heard too much about her in recent weeks, but today we've seen a judgment from the US Supreme Court where we really see the influence and part of the shift in the court. Rosemary asked an important question in that regard. How can rights like the right to religious worship be balanced to protect public health? And she's asking that in the context of this US Supreme Court ruling today and the debate in this jurisdiction over the opening of the churches. And certainly there's a legal challenge ongoing here brought by Declan Ganley to that. Anybody want to come in on that issue and give us their perspectives on how to balance, again, this fundamental right with public health reasons? István, what's the position in Hungary? Are people able to worship freely, attend church, attend services, and so on?
Well, I have never heard this problem to be raised in Hungary, and certainly the government has very maybe too strong connections to the churches, especially to the Catholic Church. So it would not try to hinder any religious practices. But I'm not sure whether it's possible in the hospitals. Actually, the problem again is a little bit different because the level, the niveau of the hospitals are often so low, actually, traditionally, that people suffer from the lack of toilet paper and there are too many people in the same room, and even the doctors are very professional, but there is a lack of nurses. So, you know, what we discuss is again how to manage the crisis, and this seems to be a luxury question, maybe for the Hungarian media, but what I have never heard about actually.
Okay, and I'm just struck because I read an article, an interview in I think it was in the Sunday Business Post at the weekend, where Declan Ganley, who's the litigant who's taken the challenge in Ireland, said that food and drink are essential necessities for everybody. For me, going to mass is a necessity in the same way. Gleam, how do you think these competing interests should be balanced, or how can we reconcile the two?
So for people who don't know who this man Declan Ganley is, he's a millionaire who makes weapons and does things in the arms sector, and would be kind of a far-right Catholic. As somebody commented, any man who says my right to go to church is more important than my right to eat is somebody who's never been hungry a day in his life, you know. I think the way you posited the question, David, is it possible to balance the rights issues? And the answer to that is absolutely it is, you know. I think that we could have done a better job here about actually naming the right to religious worship in our laws to make clear that the state was taking it into account, because it actually has taken it into account in how it's designed its regulations. I think what's actually happening in practice is that the main religious bodies themselves are supportive of restrictions because of the vulnerability of an elderly clergy and an elderly congregation. So you can balance it. I think it's also interesting that the Irish far right and ultra groups, which are small, a lot of these Irish ultra conservative groups American rhetoric and try to translate it to an Irish situation, and it's jarring and out of place, you know. So I mean, there are issues about the right to religious freedom here that should be taken into account, but I don't think we're seeing a disproportionate suppression of religion at all.
Thanks, Liam. Roisin, anything on that? Just north of the US border, any perspectives, or has that been an issue in the Canadian debate at all before we wrap up?
Yeah, I haven't really seen it figured in the Canadian debate. And I guess, you know, I would agree with what Liam said, and just going back to the balancing, the proportionality of it all. Measures have to be time limited, right? We're not going to have these measures in place forever. And it's just like it's a temporary infringement on rights. There's other ways through which one can have, for instance, scheduling, you know, how many people can be in a church at a certain point in time, just scheduling the amount of people that, so it's just like, you know, the creative ways through which we can find solutions to these supposed infringements. It's not black or white, and it's not, you know, either or. It's just a matter of creating that proportionate, really, that's really the meat of it, is just finding that balancing act.
Proportionality, also some transparency about it, and maintaining public trust as you undertake this process, and that would bring most people a long way with you, I think. It's fair to say. Any final questions? We're just coming to the end of our time, and I'm conscious of how much time our speakers have given us. That seems to be a wrap in terms of our questions. Just remains for me to thank sincerely Liam Herrick, Roisin Havida, and István for joining us this evening. It's been a real pleasure to have your insights. It's been a really enriching discussion on the back of it. Thanks to all of the, I see a round of applause there from some of our speakers. We can't give it to you in the same way, but hopefully at some stage we'll be able to welcome you to Trinity in person once things remove or come back to normal, and just to thank Aminata and Charlotte and all of the committee and Sofia for organising the event. I don't know if Charlotte or one of the committee wants to say a word to wrap up. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, and a huge thank you to you, David. You've been a wonderful moderator, and I think that everyone will agree. You kept the conversation flowing and had some wonderful points there. So thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight, and it's been a wonderful discussion and very insightful. And I will enjoy reading that article that you shared, Regine. So thank you for sharing. We will put up the video on our website, and we'll share that with you as well for you once that's shared onto my computer. Thanks for the great questions, and I don't want to keep you all any longer because I know that you've all got very busy schedules, but I guess I will let you all go back to your work, and I know that it's probably around midday, is it for you, Regine, back in Canada over there? So thank you again, and thank you, David, for taking the time as well. And hopefully, like David said, we'll be able to welcome you in person in the near future.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.